Kafka, The Metamorphosis Part 7. The mother gladly consented, but her exclamations of joy were hushed before Gregor's door. The sister first made sure that everything was in order in the room, then she allowed the mother to enter. In his great haste, Gregor had pulled the sheet down further than usual, and the many folds in which it fell gave the scene the air of a still life. This time he refrained from peeping under the sheet to spy on his mother, but he was delighted to have her near. "You may come in, he is not in sight," said his sister, and taking her mother by the hand, she led her into the room. Then Gregor heard the two frail women struggling to remove the heavy old chest. The sister undertook the hardest part of the task, despite the warnings of her mother, who feared she might do herself some harm. It took a long time. They had been struggling with the chest for 4 hours when the mother declared that it might be best to leave it where it was, that it was too heavy for them, that they would not finish moving it before the father returned, and that, with the chest in the middle of the room, Gregor would be considerably impeded in his movements, and finally, who knew whether he might not be displeased by the removal of his furniture? The mother thought he would be. The sight of the bare walls struck cold at her heart. Might Gregor not feel the same, having long grown so accustomed to the furniture, and would he not feel forsaken in his empty room? "Isn't it a fact?" said the mother in a low voice. She had spoken in whispers ever since she entered the room, so that Gregor, whose hiding place she had not yet discovered, might not overhear, not so much what she was saying, for she was persuaded that he could not understand, but the very sound of her voice. "Isn't it a fact that when we remove the furniture, we seem to imply that we are giving up all hope of seeing him cured and are wickedly leaving him to his fate? I think it would be better to keep the room just as it was before, so that Gregor will find nothing changed when he comes back to us, and will be able the more easily to forget what has happened in the meantime." On hearing his mother's words, Gregor realized how these 2 monotonous months, in the course of which nobody had addressed a word to him, must have affected his mind. He could not otherwise explain his desire for an empty room. Did he really wish to allow this warm, comfortable room, with its genial furniture, to be transformed into a cavern in which, in rapid and complete forgetfulness of his human past, he might exercise his right to crawl all over the walls? It seemed he was already so near to forgetting, and it had required nothing less than his mother's voice, which he had not heard for so long, to rouse him. Nothing should be removed. Everything must stay as it is. He could not bear to forego the good influence of his furniture, and if it prevented him from indulging his crazy impulses, then so much the better. Unfortunately, his sister was not of this opinion. She had become accustomed to assume authority over her parents where Gregor was concerned, this not without cause, and now the mother's remarks were enough to make her decide to remove not only the desk and the chest, which till now had been their only aim, but all the other furniture as well, except the indispensable sofa. This was not the result of mere childish bravado, nor the outcome of that new feeling of self-confidence, which she had just acquired so unexpectedly and painfully. No, she really believed that Gregor had need of plenty of room for exercise and that, as far as she could see, he never used the furniture. Perhaps, also, the romantic character of girls of her age was partly responsible for her decision, a sentiment which strove to satisfy itself on every possible occasion, and which now drove her to dramatize her brother's situation to such an extent so that she could devote herself to Gregor even more passionately than hitherto, for in a room over whose bare walls Gregor reigned alone, no one but Greta dare enter and stay. She did not allow herself to be turned from her resolve by her mother, made irresolute by the oppressive atmosphere of the room, and who did not hesitate now to remove the chest as best she could. Gregor could bear to see the chest removed, at a pinch, but the desk must stay. And hardly had the women left the room, panting as they pushed the chest, than Gregor put out his head to examine the possibilities of making a prudent and tactful appearance. But unfortunately it was his mother who returned first, while Greta, in the side room, her arms around the chest, was rocking it from side to side without being able to settle it in position. The mother was not used to the sight of Gregor. It might give her a serious shock. Terrified, He hastened to retreat to the other end of the sofa, but he could not prevent the sheet from fluttering slightly, which immediately attracted his mother's attention. She stopped short, stood stark still for a moment, then hurried back to Greta. Gregor assured himself that nothing extraordinary was happening. They were merely removing a few pieces of furniture, but the coming and going of the women, their little cries, the scraping of the furniture over the floor, seemed to combine in such an excruciating din that, however much he withdrew his head, contracted his legs, and pressed himself to the ground, he had to admit that he could not bear this torture much longer. They were emptying his room, taking away from him all that he loved. They had already removed the chest in which he kept his saw and his fretwork outfit. Now they were shifting his desk, which had stood so solid and fast to the floor all the time it was in use, that desk on which he had written his lessons while he was at the commercial school, at the secondary school, even at the preparatory school. However, he could no longer keep pace with their intentions, for so absent-minded had he become he had almost forgotten their existence, now that fatigue had quietened them and the clatter of the feet could no longer be heard. So he came out. The women were only leaning against the desk in the next room, recovering their breath, and he found himself so bewildered that he changed his direction 4 times. He really could not decide what he should first salvage, when suddenly he caught sight of the picture of the woman in furs which assumed tremendous importance on the bare wall. He hastily climbed up and pressed himself against the glass, which stuck to his burning belly and refreshed him delightfully. This picture, at least, which Gregor entirely covered, should not be snatched away from him by anyone. He turned his head toward the dining room door to observe the women as they returned. They had had but a short rest and were already coming back. Greta's arm was round her mother's waist, supporting her. "Well, what shall we take now?" said Greta, and she looked around. Her eyes met those of Gregor on the wall. If she succeeded in keeping her presence of mind, it was only for her mother's sake, toward whom she leaned her head to prevent her from seeing anything and said, a little too quickly, and with a trembling voice, "Come, wouldn't it be better to go back to the living room for a minute?" The girl's intention was clear to Gregor. She wished to put her mother in a safe place and then to drive him from the wall. Well, let her try. He lay over his picture, and he would not let it go. He would rather leap into his sister's face. But Greta had merely disquieted her mother. Now she turned, saw the gigantic brown stain spread over the wallpaper, and before she realized that it was Gregor she was seeing, she cried, "Oh God! Oh God!" in a screaming, raucous voice, fell on the sofa with outspread arms in a gesture of complete renunciation, and gave no further sign of life. "You, Gregor!" cried the sister, raising her fist and piercing Gregor with a look. It was the first word she had addressed to him directly ever since his metamorphosis. Then she ran to get some smelling salts from the dining room to rouse her mother from her swoon. Gregor decided to help. There was still time to save the picture. Alas, he found he had stuck fast to the glass and had to make a violent effort to detach himself. Then he hurried into the dining room as if able to give his sister some good advice, but he was obliged to content himself with remaining passively behind her while she rummaged among the bottles, and he frightened her so terribly when she turned around that a bottle fell and broke on the floor. A splinter wounded Gregor in the face, and a corrosive medicine flowed round his feet. Then Greta hastily grabbed up all the bottles she could carry and rushed into her mother, slamming the door behind her with her foot. Now Gregor was shut out from his mother, who perhaps was nearly dead through his fault. He dared not open the door lest he drive away his sister, who must stay by his mother. So there was nothing to do but wait, and gnawed by remorse and distress, he began to wander over the walls, the furniture, and the ceiling so rapidly that everything began to spin around him, till in despair he fell heavily onto the middle of the huge table. A moment passed. Gregor lay stretched there. Around all was still. Perhaps that was a good sign. But suddenly he heard a knock. The maid was naturally barricaded in her kitchen. Greta herself must go to the door. His father had returned. "What has happened?" were his first words. No doubt Greta's expression had explained everything. The girl replied in a stifled voice. Probably she leaned her face against her father's breast. Mother fainted, but she is better now. Gregor has broken out. I was waiting for that, said the father. I told you all along, but you women will never listen.